سوريا الأسد.
فيها تتعدى عروش بلادي ما بتنهد وشمسها ما حد بيردها. ما في قوة فوق الأرض علينا فيها تتعدى عروش بلادي ما بتنهد وشمسها ما حد بيردها.
مفكر حاله فرعان بأمره عم يمشي هالكون، لو جرب يتفرعن هون نكسر ايده لو مدى. مفكر حاله فرعان بأمره عم يمشي هالكون، لو جرب يتفرعن هون نكسر ايده لو مدى.
توجيه الشكر لسوريا الأسد، لسوريا حافظ الأسد، لسوريا بشار الأسد، لسوريا الشعب الأبي الصامد، لسوريا الجيش العربي. What do we know about the history of the United States military intervention into Syria? What were we told? What led to the intervention and the countries that involved themselves with the intervention, such as Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Israel? In this video, I'll be using news articles, documents, to give you a timeline about what led to the events of the Arab Spring in Syria of 2011 and what came afterwards, who was involved, and why. However, let's go back to the 1963 Syrian coup d'etat, which was a successful seizure of power in Syria by the military committee of the Syrian Regional Branch of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. The coup was planned by the military committee rather than the Ba'ath Party civilian leadership. The leader of the party consented to the conspiracy. The leading members of the military committee throughout the planning process and in the immediate aftermath of taking power were Mohammed Umran Salah Jadid and Hafez al-Assad. For several years, Syria went through additional coups and changes in leadership until March of 1971, Hafez al-Assad, an Alawite, declared himself president. The Syrian Regional Branch remained the dominant political authority in what had been a one-party state until the first multi-party election to the People's Council of Syria was held in 2012. On January 31st, 1973, Hafez al-Assad implemented a new constitution which led to a national crisis. Unlike previous constitutions, this one did not require that the president of Syria be a Muslim. This led to fierce demonstrations in Hama, Homs, and Aleppo organized by the Muslim Brotherhood. The government survived a series of armed revolts by Islamists, mainly members of the Muslim Brotherhood from 1976 to 1982. Upon Hafez al-Assad's death in 2000, his son, Bashar al-Assad, was elected as president of Syria. Bashar and his wife, Asma, a Sunni Muslim, born and educated in Britain, initially inspired hopes for democratic reforms. However, according to his critics, Bashar failed to deliver on promised reforms. And President al-Assad maintained in 2017 that no moderate opposition to the current government exists and that all opposition forces are jihadists focused on destroying the current secular leadership. His view was that the terrorist groups operating in Syria are linked to the agendas of foreign countries. Was there any truth to what Bashar al-Assad had said, that the foreign Syrian jihadists were supported by foreign entities? But what led to the revolt? To understand that, we must talk about the Arab Spring. The Spring was a series of anti-government protests and uprisings which led to armed rebellions that spread much across the Arab world in the early 2010s. It began in response to corruption and economic stagnation and was influenced by the Tunisian Revolution. in January of 2011. From Tunisia, the protest then spread to 5 other countries: Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, where either the ruler was deposed, such as Muammar Gaddafi, Hosni Mubarak, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, or major uprisings and social violence occurred, including riots, civil wars, and insurgencies. Sustained street demonstrations took place in other countries such as Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, and the Sudan. The importance of external factors versus internal factors to the protest spread, and success is contested. The wave of initial revolutions and protests faded by mid-2012 as many Arab Spring demonstrations met with violent responses from authorities, as well as from pro-government militias, counter-demonstrations, and militaries. These attacks were answered with violence from protesters in some cases, which included larger-scale conflicts in the Syrian civil war. However, not as all is what it seems. A U.S. diplomatic cable leaked by Wikileaks have been seen as showing that regime change in Syria may have been a covert foreign policy goal of the U.S. government in the years leading up to the civil war, even during the period when President Barack Obama was publicly engaging with Syria's Bashir al-Assad. A 2006 memorandum by United States diplomat William Roebuck of the embassy in Damascus stated, quote, "We believe Bashar's weakness are in how he chooses to react to looming issues, both perceived and real, such as the potential threat to the regime from the increasing presence of transiting Islamist extremists. This cable summarizes our assessment of these vulnerabilities and suggests that there are actions, statements, and signals that the U.S. government can send that will improve the likelihood of such opportunities arising. These proposals will need to be fleshed out and converted into real actions, and we need to be ready to move quickly to take advantage of such opportunities. Many of our suggestions underline using public diplomacy and more indirect means to send messages that influence the inner circle," end quote. According to Seymour Hersh, legendary independent reporter and political writer, along with activist Robert Naiman, a policy analyst, researcher, and writer, and Roebuck, who went on to be charged in the affairs of the Libyan embassy under Obama, also considered the advantages of promoting religious sectarianism in Syria. Following the start of the Arab Spring in 2011, protests in Syria against the Assad regime were violently suppressed and a civil war began. By 2012, there were armed several opposition groups appearing in the country, including the Free Syrian Army, which formed in July of 2011 by officers who defected from the Syrian armed forces. In 2012, the al-Nusra Front, which is a group described as Al-Qaeda in Syria, a Salafist jihadist organization fighting against government forces, was eclipsed by its only creator, and Al-Qaeda severed its ties to another group called the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in February 2014 after an 8-month power struggle. Scott Wilson of the Washington Post would write about the demonstrations on April 25th, 2011, in which he said Syrian leaders deployed tanks and troops against unarmed demonstrators Monday in a sharp escalation of their effort to crush the widening protest movement, prompting the Obama administration to condemn the deadly crackdown and weigh additional sanctions against the embattled government. The Syrian army entered the city of Dara, the cradle of anti-government unrest near the border with Jordan and other southern towns as protesters massed in the streets. According to witnesses and news reports, about 25 demonstrators were killed in Dara and the coastal city of Jabhat, where witnesses said snipers opened fire on the crowd. However, the snipers were not linked to the Syrian armed forces. This would lead to Roebuck's cable regarding the United States government taking advantage of the Islamists causing unrest to be rather truthful. During the course of the war, it would later come out that the United States had a more direct investment. According to Luke Coffey, a research fellow specializing in transatlantic and Eurasian security at a Washington, D.C. based think tank, he would write in Al Jazeera that Arab Spring was really a spring for Al-Qaeda, in which he said during a recent television interview promoting his new book, former CIA Deputy Director Michael Morrell admitted something that most of us had already known. The United States misjudged the so-called Arab Spring, and as a consequence, the Arab Spring was really a spring for Al-Qaeda. This sort of after-the-fact analysis by former Obama administration officials have become commonplace. Frankly, beyond helping with book sales and ensuring a top spot of the lucrative speaking circuit, admissions of his kind have very little practical value. To many, the obvious question is, why weren't these observations or critiques made while these officials were still holding office and able to change or influence policy? Morrell's comments should not come as a surprise to any of us. The fact that decision makers in the West were willing to accept the term Arab Spring to describe the popular uprising showed how little the policymakers understood about what was actually happening on the ground. Instead of the Arab Spring, what the world was witnessing should have been called the Arab generation. Those who took to the streets demanding change were from a generation of young Arabs who saw little future for themselves, but thanks to advancements in global communications, the internet and social media, knew that there is an alternative to stale autocratic rule. However, that surely isn't just the case. According to Mike Morrell, he would later say this about U.S. policy on the Islamic State and the Levant in Syria.
What then is your analysis about how long and how difficult the struggle will be? You just heard me talk to General Breedlove about, training. I mean, most people say it's a little and it's too late. But what is your analysis of how long it's going to take to defeat ISIS and what you fear they might do?
Yeah, Christian, I have a great deal of confidence that what we're doing on the Iraq side of the border is working. We have taken back about 25% of the territory that ISIS took during its blitzkrieg. And it's going to be a slow process. And unfortunately, the Iranians are in there helping us. But we are going to slowly take that territory back. So I'm confident in our Iraqi strategy. We have air power and we have ground troops in the form of the Iraqi military, the Kurdish military, and Iranian-trained Shia militia. But on the Syrian side of the border, I don't have a lot of confidence that our strategy is going to work. It's not that it's too late, Christian, it's that it's too little. We need to train ground troops in very large numbers if we're going to be able to take back territory from ISIS in Syria. And what I fear is that we're going to be successful in Iraq, we're going to have a hammer in Iraq, but no anvil in Syria. So the ISIS guys are just going to go across the border into Syria, and they're going to have a safe haven in eastern Syria where they're going to be able to continue to plot, and that plotting will include plotting against us.
But whose fault was it? Surely it couldn't have been Assad's. In 2011, at the direction of US President Barack Obama, the Central Intelligence Agency was put in charge of operations worth about $1 billion annually to arm anti-government forces in Syria, an operation which formally began in 2013 more than 2 years after the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011. Prior to 2013, the CIA only supplied certain rebel groups of the Free Syrian Army with non-lethal aid, but later began providing training, funding, and intelligence to selected rebel commanders. This was codenamed Timber Sycamore. Although a former intelligence advisor who spoke to journalist Seymour Hersh claimed the CIA had been facilitating the flow of arms from Libya to Syria in collaboration with the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar since 2012, the first confirmed CIA weapons arrived in the spring of 2014, in which he said there were just a handful delivered to only one rebel group carefully vetted by the CIA. The group, Harakat Hazem, or the Steadfast Movement, showed off the new weapon systems by posting the first successful strike on YouTube in April of 2014. Another of the groups being vetted was the Islamist Army of Mujahideen, formed in January 2014, specifically to combat the Islamic State in Levant. However, there were indicators that the army of the Mujahideen was still being vetted in September 2014, and the CIA began to spread its branch to other Islamist groups outside of the two groups, such as the Harakat Azim and the Islamic Army of the Mujahideen. Many of those weapons began to flow to other groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State and the Levant. Whether it was indirect or direct, it didn't matter. The CIA, with pressure from Israel and Jordan, led by CIA Director David Petraeus, wanted to intervene and help to overthrow the Bashir al-Assad government. The Wikileaks document proved to be prophecy. What was the foreign policy of the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, the three countries who have a vested interest in Syria? What was it like for the foreign policy directives of each country? The United States foreign policy with Syria began with Syrians' independence in 1945, in which they established a U.S. consulate in Damascus on September 7, 1946, appointing George Wadsworth to be the diplomatic mission. Shortly thereafter, there were many CIA activities in Syria, including a coup d'etat on March 30th, 1949, of Syrian Army Colonel Husni al-Zaim, who seized power from President Shukri al-Kawati in a bloodless coup d'etat. There are highly controversial allegations that the American legislation in Syria, headed by James Hugh Keeley Jr., and the CIA engineered the coup. Also, an attempt at regime change in 1956, in which the CIA made plans to overthrow the Syrian government because it would not cooperate with Western anti-communism. Operation Struggle in 1956, in which National Security Council member Wilbur Crane Evelyn, CIA official Archibald Roosevelt, and Mikhail Bey-Ilian, former Syrian minister, met in Damascus on July 1st, 1956, to discuss a U.S.-backed anti-communist takeover of the country. Operation Wappen in 1957, in which DCI Allen Dulles continued to file reports about the dangers of communism in Syria. The CIA planned for another coup, codenamed Operation Wappen, organized by Kermit Roosevelt. Syrian military officers were paid off in anticipation. An assassination plot in 1957 revealed that a plot including collaboration with the British intelligence service MI6 to assassinate 3 Syrian officials in Damascus. The targets were Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj, head of military intelligence, Hafez al-Bizni, Army Chief of Staff, and Khalid Bakdash, leader of the Syrian Communist Party. Then, Much later, the CIA used Syria as an illicit base of operations to torture so-called ghost detainees as part of a program known as Extraordinary Rendition, approved by the White House Legal Counsel and Vice President Dick Cheney. This program was established in the mid-1990s under President Bill Clinton and expanded in the 2000s after the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001. One target of the program, Syrian-born Canadian Mahir Arar, was detained in New York and sent to Syria, where he was interrogated and tortured. Arar, a telecommunications engineer who had been a Canadian citizen since 1991, was asked to confess his connections to al-Qaeda at the terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. Then, the CIA conducted paramilitary raids between the years 2004 to 2008 on the town of Shukriya in eastern Syria. The raid involved about 24 U.S. commandos and specifically equipped Black Hawk helicopters. Syria accused the U.S. of committing terrorist aggression and said that 8 civilians have been killed. The U.S. responded that all people killed in the raid were militants. And then, of course, the Syrian civil war led by the Arab Spring in 2011, in which WikiLeaks reported that the U.S. government had been covertly funding Syrian opposition groups since 2006, mainly the London-based Movement for Justice and Development in Syria and an associate satellite TV channel, Harada TV. The CIA's Special Activities Division teams were said to have been deployed to Syria during the uprising to ascertain rebel groups, leadership, and potential supply routes. Under the aegis of Operation Timber Sycamore and other clandestine activities, CIA operatives and U.S. Special Operation troops have trained and armed nearly 10,000 rebel fighters to the cost of $1 billion a year. But why? Was it foreign policy between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel that led to the degradation of talks, which led to the Syrian civil war and their involvement? So first, we'll have to understand U.S. foreign policy with the United States. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the Syrian government began limited cooperation with the U.S. in the war on terror. In one such case, Syrian intelligence alerted the U.S. of an al-Qaeda plan similar to USS Cole bombing, which was to fly a hang glider loaded with explosives into the U.S. Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Syria's opposition to the Iraq war deteriorated relations. Syria's contention arose because the Syrian government failed to prevent foreign fighters from using Syrian borders to enter Iraq and refused to deport the elements from the former Saddam Hussein government that support Iraqi insurgency. In turn, Syrian officials had concerns due to the high influx of Iraqi refugees into their country. In May 2003, the U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell visited Damascus to demand Syrian closure of the offices of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In 2008, the CIA and the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, known as JSOC, carried out paramilitary raids targeting al-Qaeda in Iraq in the town of Shukriya in Abu Kamal. Accusations of terrorism, in which Syria is considered to be a secular dictatorship with poor human rights, stated that Syria had been on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism since the list's inception in 1979 and deemed it as a safe haven for terrorists. Syria rejected its classification by the U.S. as a state sponsor of terrorism. The United States war on Syria continued. Economic sanctions, in which executive orders, a series of them, enacted by President George W. Bush, which included executive orders 11315, 13224, 13382, 13441. These sanctions are imposed on Syrian citizens or entities due to their participation in terrorism acts of public corruption or their destabilization activities in Iraq and Lebanon. However, there was no evidence that Syria had ever engaged in terrorist operations or harboring terrorism. In fact, that would be the same for Libya, Iraq, and in Bahrain and Jordan, as well as Iran. All these countries have one thing in common. They are majority Shia, and they are the enemies to Israel and Saudi Arabia. The United States is only acting on certain orders from both of those countries. With Israel, relations with Syria had technically been in a state of war since 1948, when both came into being. They have fought each other in three major wars: the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the 1967 Six-Day War, and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Since 1974, there have been a ceasefire arrangement between the two countries along the so-called Purple Line. The Purple Line is basically the ceasefire line between Israel and Syria after the Six-Day War, which has largely been adhered by both countries, though not by Hezbollah. However, both countries have been involved in the 1982 Lebanon War and the Lebanese Civil War. Israel's official position in the Syrian civil war has been strict neutrality, as per various Israeli defense ministers. However, in a July 2017, Israel's defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, said that while the rebels are not our friends, they are all versions of al-Qaeda. Israel could not allow a man like Bashir al-Assad to remain in power. Keeping Assad in power is not in our security interests. As long as he is in power, Iran and Hezbollah will be in Syria. He said that Israel had no interest in entering the Syrian civil war, but that there were red lines Israel had set, such as the smuggling of sophisticated weaponry to Hezbollah and Iran's presence on its borders. Meanwhile, Iran and Hezbollah, along with other Iranian proxy forces, are in Syria to fight against groups like the Islamic State in Levant and Jabhat al-Nusra, as well as the dozens of others of Syrian jihadist groups that are being supported by the CIA and Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries. Lieberman also conceded that in October of 2017, Assad was winning the war and was now being courted by foreign powers, which he said was unprecedented. The statement was said to have marked a reversal for Israel, where top officials have from the outset of fighting in 2011 until mid-2015 regularly predicted Assad would lose control of the country and be toppled. Later, in July of 2017, a new ceasefire agreement was directly brokered by the United States and Russia for southwest Syria. Russia had involved itself at the behest of Bashar al-Assad in helping with aerial bombing of the jihadist rebels, which were taking control of the capital Damascus, Homs, and Deir ez-Zor. Meanwhile, Israel would later come out and admitting that they were helping and even ministering medical aid in Golan Heights hospitals to injured rebel groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra. On several occasions, Israel reportedly carried out or supported attacks on Hezbollah and Iranian targets with Syrian territories or Lebanon. One of the first reliability reported incidents of this kind took place on January 30th, 2013, when Israeli aircraft struck a Syrian convoy allegedly transporting Iranian weapons to Hezbollah. However, Israel refused to comment on the incident, and a stance that is believed to seek to ensure that the Syrian government did not feel obliged to retaliate. There were no evidence that they were supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon or even in Syria. What about Saudi Arabia? Well, a Syrian mission was opened in Saudi Arabia in 1941 when Syria was still under the control of the French Mandate. King Abdul Aziz reportedly supported the independence of Syria and Lebanon from the Hashemite dynasty and the French Mandate. At the end of November of 1970, Syria's neo-Ba'ath leaders were toppled and removed, and Hafez al-Assad became ruler of Syria. Diplomatic negotiations between the two countries were opened and renewed. With the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt in 1972, relations between Syria and Saudi Arabia improved even further. During the 1990s, the relations between Saudi Arabia and Syria were positive. Following the invasion of Kuwait by then Iraqi President Saddam Hussein in August of 1990, Syria took part in the US-led international coalition that was established to defend Saudi Arabia and liberate Kuwait. In the 2000s, in a start of rapprochement between the two countries, Saudi Arabia appointed an ambassador to Syria, Abdullah al-Ifan. Bashir al-Assad visited Riyadh in September of 2009, and in October, King Abdullah visited Assad in Damascus. Syria would appoint a new ambassador, Mehdi Dakala, to Saudi Arabia in the same month. However, after the Syrian civil war in 2011, damaged relations between the two countries due to Saudi Arabia sending weapons to the opposition forces while Iran sent arms to the Syrian government and allied forces began. Saudi King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to condemn the Assad government in 2011 due to its method to deal with the anti-government demonstrations. As a result of these events, Saudi Arabia withdrew its delegation from the Arab League's peacekeeping mission in Syria in 2012 and closed its embassy in Damascus in February, expelling the Syrian ambassador. In March of 2018, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, said in an interview that Bashar al-Assad is staying, but I believe that Bashar's interests is not to let the Iranians do whatever they want to do. This was interpreted as a break from the previous Saudi insistence that Assad leave office. However, he also stated his opposition to withdrawal of U.S. Special Operation Forces from eastern Syria, which is under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces rather than the Assad government. So what led to all this? And why is the United States, through the CIA, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, showing a vested interest in Syria? To understand that, we must understand previous foreign policies, such as the Bush Doctrine and the Israeli foreign policy, the Yangon Plan. The CIA Operation Timber Sycamore was ended in 2017 under President Donald Trump. However, many media pundits, as well as former CIA operatives and intelligence security analysts, such as Bob Baer, in which he would quote, "It is a strategic mistake. Support for the rebels was a pressure point on Assad and a pressure point on the Iranians and the Russians. It looks like to me that he just gave them a gift to Vladimir Putin for no quid pro quo, and that's not the way diplomacy works. We should have used this. We should have demanded, for example, safe zones so the Sunnis wouldn't get hit from the air. So this is just inexplicable. Why would he do this?" End quote. It seems that the CIA, led by the State Department, as well as Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, had indeed a vested interest to depose and force regime change, not just in Syria, but in Libya, Iraq, Egypt, Afghanistan, and other countries that did not fall in line with the West and Israel. And if you didn't fall in line, you were made a victim. And in most cases, you were made to go to the grave while your country burned in ashes. The Syrian civil war and the Syria war in general, and the conflicts that arose from it, and the support of Syrian jihadists, would led to the massacres and deaths of many Shias, Alawites, Sufis, were all supported and neither condemned by the United States, Israel, and the Gulf. It was all supported by all three. The next question is, when will the people start demanding a change in foreign policy and to get rid of the perceived allies which help precipitate the problems in Syria and the Middle East?